My name is Susan Abulhawa, and I'm a writer. I'm a novelist and a poet, political commentator. I'm also a scientist, a mother, a dog lover, recent cat lover.
You have an educational background in science. You are, in fact, a science writer for medical journals. How does that work inform your literary writing?
I was actually not just a medical writer, I was a researcher for many years in neuroscience. I was a lab rat. And when I left the lab, I started doing medical writing. That happened at the same time that I was taking a shot at fiction and writing Mornings in Jenin. And I haven't really done medical writing since 2013, so I'm semi-retired from that. You know, people always think of science as a kind of more rigid, technical, mathematical type of writing, and to some extent it is, but coming up with scientific ideas and various experiments, it requires some creativity as well. But I do feel distinctly different states of mind when I'm writing one or the other. In fiction and poetry, but fiction in particular is just very different. It's a lot harder. It's a lot more precarious and unpredictable and moody, and it requires more of an emotional investment. And when I'm writing fiction, I'm always writing, and you know, I'm writing in the shower, I'm writing when I'm driving. I mean, it's always turning in my head. Whereas the science writing is kind of just, you know, I create an outline and I know what I'm going to write ahead of time. So whereas I just don't do that with fiction.
You actually grew up in Jerusalem, and so you talked about how even in the 1980s, Jerusalem had the feel of an old village with green hills and old Arab homes. In spite of the fact that there was an occupation, but that by 2001, a lot of that landscape was cluttered. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more, and also tell us what you think about this idea of progress.
So it was actually 2000 when I went back to Palestine after an 18-year absence, and 2001 was when I founded Playgrounds for Palestine. But it was kind of heartbreaking, actually, and it's only gotten worse since then. I mean, it's visibly gotten worse. I mean, Israel's been, you know, really rushing to establish a Jewish presence and a Jewish majority and Jewish control of the city. And they expanded the boundaries, of course, of Jerusalem and been colonizing that in earnest and building these, you know, tall, ugly, high-rise residential buildings that have no relevance to this ancient, fabled city. And you can see it. You can see the delineations of what began and grew organically versus what was just transplanted, what's alien, and what doesn't belong. I mean, it's very visible. Europeans sort of have promulgated this idea of modernity and progress as looking a certain way and being distinctly European. And so, you know, Zionists were European. I mean, they came from that background. They came from that very racist background, from that very, from that same sense of intellectual and moral superiority, and that included a certain visual scenery, you know, and they've transplanted that in Palestine, but it's actually been really not just aesthetically devastating, but ecologically devastating. They always touted, you know, we made the desert bloom. It was of course a huge lie. I mean, they actually did quite the opposite. They made bloom become desert. They bought all these pine trees, you know, they wanted this European scenery. And they also, you know, pine trees grow relatively quickly, and they wanted this quick sort of forestation process to cover up a lot of the ruins of the villages that they depopulated, Palestinian villages. And it's a way of sort of erasing traces of the indigenous population. What they brought in weren't local, they weren't native to the land, and they have these very acidic leaves that dropped and sort of killed all the natural native flora, and they were very dry. They were all sort of the same age, the same size and height and so forth, and they were very vulnerable to heat. And so you saw these massive wildfires across the whole country recently. And it's so that's one thing. They drained the Hula wetlands, thinking, oh, it was like touted as Zionist ingenuity, but in fact they destroyed a very lush and rich entire ecosystem in the Hula Valley wetlands. There's so many examples like this. Diverting the Jordan River that has reduced that river to a shadow of its former self, and in turn has really degraded the Dead Sea. They called it progress and ingenuity and agricultural genius and what have you. But in fact, it was completely antithetical to life.
Your first novel, Mornings in Jenin, was written after you visited a Palestinian camp in Jenin, and this was in 2002, which was it was in the aftermath of a massive Israeli attack on the camp. Could you share a little bit about what that experience was like for you?
Well, it was a massacre that Israel committed in the refugee camp of Jenin, and I was one of the first so-called international eyewitnesses to the immediate aftermath of that. And they began a weeks-long sort of cleanup campaign. They wouldn't allow reporters in and so forth. We were able to sneak in just a day actually before they opened the camp, and it was actually life-changing to witness something like that. I read about pogroms and massacres and violence. I mean, you're Palestinian, you're sort of exposed to these stories and these images too, and these narratives. But it was a completely different experience to be there and to see things and to smell. The smell was a really overwhelming memory of that time, because there were a lot of decomposing bodies that people could not get to, and we were frantically trying to recover those. And I was among a couple of groups that pulled out several bodies that had already been decomposed. Some of them were terribly bloated, and bodies of small human beings. And so it was, it was something that just sort of shifted the course of my life, really, and made me question what I was doing in the United States and my participation in this sort of corporate environment, and is that really where I wanted to be?
The protagonist of your first novel, Mornings in Jenin, is a woman. Your second book, The Blue Between Sky and Water, also focuses on women's stories and centers their voices. Why are you interested in female characters, and how does that fit the Palestinian narrative?
Well, women are more interesting to me. Their lives are, in my view, more complicated, more interesting, more layered. I think that's true in every society. I think it's more true in situations of oppression, of this kind of layered violence and layered patriarchy. Being a woman, obviously I understand women better. Sometimes I think I don't understand men at all. And it fascinates me to kind of explore the inner lives of women. And I also come from a family of women, a large family of women, and we always sort of, living in a kind of conservative Muslim culture, women have a separate world sometimes from men, where we gather together, and even from a young age, I understood that not only is the outside world not privy to this world, but even the men in our family were not privy to it. And you know, my family, I wasn't like, I mean, we were conservative Muslims, but we weren't like segregated in that way. You know, the men in our family were very much part of our inner circles, of course. But still, there was this, you know, when we went off together, you know, my grandmother and my aunts and my cousins, and there was a different atmosphere, and it fascinates me, and I love it, and it forms a foundation to many of my childhood memories. I mean, it's kind of an anchor in a way.
You've talked about how once your characters come to life, your only goal is to be true to them.
What I mean is that I will filter out these sort of editorial voices that might be the voice of a publisher or a reader or a family member or something. And because I really just want to focus on the life of the character, getting to know them, exploring their life, and writing them in a way that's honest and authentic. I want my loyalty to be to their lives, to portraying them in an honest and authentic way, without sort of this, you know, subconscious or a sense of how other people might react to it. And this kind of comes more into play when I'm writing about sexuality, especially, you know, the environment that my characters live in. It just becomes a sensitive topic. Okay, so here's an example. In the text, the characters refer to the Jews, right? A lot of my readers are Westerners who have kind of a visceral reaction to that term, the Jews. It sounds anti-Semitic to them, and it's difficult to digest. But the truth is, that's how Palestinians speak. When we say the Jews, everybody knows what Jews we're talking about. It's not anti-Semitism, but the reality is that, I mean, we're not saying Jews in general. It's the Jews. It's these people who did this to us. So, you know, when kids are running through the streets or something, you know, they'll say, the Jews are coming, the Jews are coming. That's how they speak. So if I'm going to be honest and present the lives of these characters with, you know, with truth and authenticity, I have to say that.
Your book, Mornings in Jenin, has been translated in many, many different languages, including Arabic. And so I was just wondering, how did the Arabic-speaking world react to the book? And was there any difference between their reaction and your Western audiences and how they reacted to the book?
The reactions have mostly been positive. I think that the translation was problematic in many ways, and I kind of regret not really going through it myself and just kind of trusting the publishers to get it right. So much was lost in translation, which is unfortunate because Arabic really does lend itself to sort of lyrics and poetry. I mean, it's just a poetically charged language, and so it was too bad that that's how the translation was. Some people reacted to sexuality in the book, even though there were censors who took some of that out. And you know, those reactions were interesting. Like, I got some mothers who came up to me and said, you know, I love this book, but I can't let my daughter read it. You know, of course the daughters read it. They just rolled their eyes. And then it was banned in Jordan because there's one line in there that sort of referred to a very, you know, well-documented bit of history in which there was actually a collaboration between the Jordanian government, you know, King Abdullah and Golda Meir, and there was also collaboration during the '67 war. So, I mean, everybody knows it, but they just didn't, you know, they banned it. Arabs who read it in the English version, the reactions I got from those folks actually were some of the most impactful for me, and the most precious, because I got a lot of messages and comments from young Palestinian Americans and Palestinians from Europe, and people, who have grown up in the diaspora, many of whom were either first or second or third generation Palestinians. And the uniting theme was, number one, it sort of helped them understand who they are and what they come from. And there was another theme that actually made me cry one time. This one letter. This one young lady wrote to me, and she said, we've been in the United States for many years, and me and all my siblings have read it, and my kids have read it, and we all feel like for the first time we understand our father. Yeah. So it's still really effective,
You wrote a very interesting article. It was called "The Palestinian Struggle is a Black Struggle," and I was just wondering if you could give us the thesis of that article.
Well, first let me say that I objected to that title, just because I felt like there was a kind of appropriation of someone else's struggle, and the way I referred to it was it's the essential blackness of the Palestinian struggle, as political blackness, and not without sort of saying that our struggle is a black struggle. There was a big sort of back and forth exchange that I made that became public. And I actually kind of alluded to this in Mornings in Jenin, and with the main character, Amal, sort of living in a predominantly, or she was actually working and living in a predominantly black area, and talking about the affinity that she felt to those communities versus the kind of suspicion that she faced in white communities. And I've always felt that. I've always felt a greater affinity to Black culture and Black communities and their way of life, because I think that I feel that there's so many parallels between our respective struggles, and really, struggles, all colonial struggles, anti-colonial struggles. There is this kind of systematic denigration of their humanity, trivializing of their lives, dismissing their lives, commodifying their lives, and destroying their lives. And it's very systematic. And their struggle spans centuries more than ours, and it spans greater levels of intensity than ours, of course. But I think, we arrive sort of at a similar place. The oppressors' protocols and programs running in parallel and intersecting, and, you see so many police chiefs and police personnel sort of going to Israel to train and they bring these brutal techniques back, and they employ them. They employ the techniques and the weaponry on mostly Black and brown bodies in this country. So much of the surveillance techniques, and there's so much overlap and exchange of this sort of technological oppression. I'm working on a novel now that's almost done. It's about a Palestinian prostitute, a sex worker, and it's set initially in Kuwait. It's just something, it's kind of this big open secret in the Gulf region that nobody ever wants to talk about, which is this extensive and elaborate sex industry. Wherever there's the kind of unlimited money and powerful men, you can expect that kind of exploitation of women and girls and boys. So I wanted to write about that, and I wanted to include that somehow. And I think this is one of those, this is another example of that kind of that, those chattering voices from the outside that want to sort of interfere in a novel, and me really actively pushing them back, because I think this is the kind of topic that would be, sensitive, to put it mildly, that would probably make me lose a lot of readers and upset some people who might like me now. But it's, again, I found a character that I really care about, and I want to tell her story.